Good evening, Dr. De La Peña. Good evening, classmates. My report is all about categories, criteria, and formats used to analyze, adopt, and construct teaching materials. But my topic is only focused on the criteria on how to evaluate instructional materials and the criteria on how to select learning materials. I will be your fifth discussant, still in Group 1, and my name is Rosemary Abcede. So let's start. Since my topic has something to do with criteria, let us first define what is criteria. So criteria is something that is used as a reason to make a judgment or decision. I do believe most of us teachers are using and creating criteria in order for us to easily and fairly grade or evaluate our students' written and performance works, right? Speaking of evaluation, there are different types of evaluation. But right now, we're just going to focus with the criterion-reference evaluation. So now, what do we mean by that? Criterion-reference evaluation is the process of grading or evaluating the learning of our students against the set of pre-specified qualities or criteria without the reference of the achievements of others. So under criterion-reference evaluation, there are two. Namely, the universal criteria and the local criteria. So let's start with the universal criteria. So universal criteria is the criteria for the development and evaluation of language learning materials which can be applied to any materials for any learner. So allow me to emphasize the phrase any material and any learner. So in universal criteria, it is applicable for all. There is no specific material and there's no specific learner. So now the question is, how are we going to develop a universal criteria? So we have 4 ways on how to develop universal criteria. Number 1, brainstorm statements of beliefs. So in here, we are just going to brainstorm and think, we are just going to think of the possible qualities or points that we think can be included or should be included in evaluating the instructional materials. Like for example, the learners should have the following criteria. For example, learners should be exposed to the target language in use, affectively engaged, cognitively engaged, help to make discoveries about how the target language is typically used, and encouraged to use the target language for themselves. So that is number 1. Second is turn the beliefs into interrogative criteria. So how is that? So after constructing the key points that you think that should be included in the criteria of evaluating instructional materials, you will just turn it into questions. Like for example, to what extent are the learners likely to be effectively engaged by the reading text? To what extent are the learners given opportunities to use the target language for purposeful communication? And lastly, how likely is it that the learners will be able to understand the instructions? Third, use the criteria to evaluate materials. So after we gather and brainstorm criteria, after we turn it into questions, now is the time for us to try it or try the criteria that we have created into a learning material. So these are the reasons why. First, to save time, a representative sample of the materials can be evaluated. Second, scoring each criterion on a scale from 1 to 5 can be informative. Third, some criteria which are considered to be really important could be scored out of 10. Fourth, ideally, the materials should be independently evaluated by more than one evaluator. And the last one, an instrument for recording scores and comments is needed. So, and the last procedure on how to create a universal criteria is to revise the criteria. After using the criteria that you have created in evaluating the material, now is the time for us to revise the criteria. Of course, this is the time or the last step in creating universal criteria. because you already know what are the criteria that is needed to be revised, needed to replace, or to develop. So I have here some examples of questions. 1. To what extent are the materials likely to engage the learners effectively and cognitively? Second, and the last one, to what extent are the listening texts likely to engage the learners cognitively? So I have here example of universal criteria, which is from the adapted material. So number, questions, and answer. So question number 1, do the materials provide useful opportunities for the learners to think for themselves? Second, are the instructions clear? Third, do the materials cater for different preferred learning styles? Fourth, are the materials likely to achieve effective engagement? So that is the universal criteria. Now let's proceed with the local criteria. So local criteria is the criteria which are specific to a particular context of learning. So it is the opposite of universal criteria. So in local criteria, the criteria should only be used in a particular subject, in a particular learner. Like for example, or in a specific learner and a specific material. Like for example, you are going to evaluate English book or English module for grade 9. So of course, the criteria that you are going to create is only for that. Only for English 9 module and only for English 9 book and only for English 9 students. Or grade 9 students, I mean. So that is the local criteria. So now, same with universal criteria. The question is, how are we going to develop local criteria? So there are 5 ways on how to develop local criteria. Number 1, specify a profile of the target learning context. So in here, you are going to look for the background of the learning material that you are going to evaluate. Like, when is it constructed? When is the last time it was adopted? Or it is revised? Or analyzed? Something like that. Second, develop a criteria. So of course, after knowing the background of the learning material that you are going to evaluate, you are going to formulate criteria specific for that material because we are in the local criteria. Third, categorize the criteria. So now, after formulating the criteria that is intended for a specific material and a specific learner, we are now going to categorize it. What criteria are attainable? What criteria are easy to define? Something like that. Fourth, apply the criteria to materials. Of course, like universal criteria, we are now going to apply it or evaluate a certain material using the criteria that you have formulated. And the last step, revise the criteria. Since we are done trying it, now of course, like in the universal criteria, we will know what are the criteria that is in need to revise, in need to develop, or in need to replace. Something like that. So again, there are 2 criteria, namely the universal criteria and the local criteria. In the universal criteria, again, it is intended or applicable for all. There is no specific learner, there is no specific material. Meanwhile, in local criteria, there is specific material and there is specific learner. So those are the criteria that you're just going to use intended for a certain material or a certain learner. Now, let's proceed to the next one. Since we are done discussing about developing a criteria in the universal and local criteria, now the question is, what are the criteria in developing a criteria? So these are the 5 things or 5 characteristics that we should bear in mind in creating a criteria, both in universal and in local. Let's have the first one. So the first one is the evaluative. So evaluative meaning to say, it has value. Of course, when you are going to create criteria, make sure it has value. Because we are not going to create a criteria without value, right? Because we all know that the criteria helps us to make judgment or decision in a certain work or in a certain material, right? Second, specific. Of course, being specific meaning to say it is easy to define. In making a criteria, it doesn't need to make a difficult one. Much better if it is specific. Third, answerable. So, if you're going to go back to the previous discussion, so, right, in step 2 in making universal criteria, it is said there, turn the criteria into questions. Why? Because if you turn the criteria that you have created into questions, you will know if those criteria are answerable. And that is one characteristic that a criteria should have. Fourth, valid. So meaning to say valid, it is well-founded. So, reasonable. So a criteria should be well-founded and reasonable. Of course, we will not create a criteria or a certain criteria just because we want it or just because it pops to our mind. We should create a criteria that is reasonable. And the last one would be the reliable. The reliable meaning to say the quality of the criteria is consistent. Likewise, right, in the construction of language test, same with evaluation of learning material or instructional material. If the criteria is valid, it should be reliable. And if the criteria is reliable, it should be valid. So that's it. So again, so there are 5 characteristics of a criteria that it should have. First, evaluative. Second, specific. Third, answerable. Fourth, valid. And fifth is the reliable. So now let's proceed to the last one. So my last topic is criteria in selecting learning materials. So I know for sure that you already know this one since Dr. Del Peña told us to read this and it is part of our reflection number 1. So allow me to quite explain or have a little explanation about this one. Number 1, accuracy and visual appeal. So accuracy meaning to say, in choosing learning material, let us bear in mind that a learning material should be or should have no errors. The informations are correct. There's no grammatically wrong sentences and so on and so forth. And it has strong visual appeal. Second, alignment to standards or depth of knowledge. So in selecting instructional materials or learning materials, it should align to the curriculum. Like right now, right, we are in the K-12 curriculum. So if you're going to search about this, no, all the learning materials or all the instructional materials are aligned to the K-12 curriculum. And to private schools, they align their learning materials in their philosophy, in their core values, same with, and align also with K-12 curriculum, something like that. And in that depth of knowledge, meaning to say, here there are questions in the learning materials that promotes higher order thinking skills. And the third, ease of use one. So let us bear in mind that in choosing learning material, it should be learner friendly, teacher friendly. Because if in that case, they can understand it easily. And of course, as teachers, we can understand the learning material itself easily. And another thing is that the instructions, the assessments, or the activities there should be clear and easy to understand also. And the last one will be engagement, ability to meet student needs. So let's bear in our mind that in choosing learning material, our top priority should be our learners, right? it should be them. So let us bear in our mind that in choosing learning material, it should be aligned or applicable to the level of learning of our students, to their learning style, to their ability, and that learning material should meet the needs of our students and should hook the interest of our students, and the activities there should be differentiated and applicable for hands-on, individual, group, and so on and so forth. So that would be all for my report. So here are my references. So if you don't have any more questions, thank you for listening.